Some truths don't break your heart when you find them. The old librarian had once told Emily Carter. They break it when you realize how long they were hidden. Emily never imagined those words would follow her into one of the largest mansions in Connecticut. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows as she stood alone in the west wing of Reed Manor. The house was so quiet she could hear the ticking of a grandfather clock 3 rooms away. Dust floated through beams of afternoon light. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books nobody had touched in years. Jonathan Reed had hired her only 3 weeks earlier to help organize the estate's private library before a major renovation. It was simple work: cataloging documents, sorting archives, preserving family records. The kind of job Emily desperately needed after months of struggling to stay ahead of bills. Every morning she arrived before 8. Every evening she left without seeing much of the billionaire owner himself. Yet, even from a distance, Jonathan Reed seemed different from the powerful men she had encountered before. He greeted staff by name. He carried his own coffee. He listened when people spoke. For a man worth billions, he possessed a surprising kind of quiet. That afternoon, the storm outside grew heavier. Wind brushed against the windows while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Emily balanced on a small ladder near the far end of the library, reaching toward a shelf hidden behind an old portrait. The painting showed Jonathan's father, William Reed, standing beside a stone fireplace with the confidence of a man accustomed to being admired. Emily carefully removed several books. Something felt strange. The shelf behind them seemed deeper than the others. She frowned. Running her fingers along the wood, she felt a slight groove. Curious, she pressed against it. A soft click echoed through the room. Emily froze. For a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. Then part of the shelving shifted inward by an inch. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she stepped down from the ladder and pulled the hidden panel open. Behind it sat a narrow compartment covered in dust. There was no jewelry, no stacks of cash, no family treasure. Only a small metal lockbox and a single sealed envelope resting on top. The paper had yellowed with age. Emily reached for it carefully. Her fingers trembled as she brushed away years of dust. Written across the front in faded blue ink were only 6 words. Jonathan must never know what happened that night. The room suddenly felt colder. Outside, rain struck the glass harder. Emily stared at the envelope, unable to look away. Something about the handwriting felt urgent, desperate, as if whoever had written those words believed the truth inside should remain buried forever. She knew she should stop. She knew the letter was private. Yet the hidden compartment, the warning, the secrecy, none of it made sense. Taking a slow breath, Emily looked toward the empty doorway. No footsteps, no voices, only silence. The kind of silence that seemed to be waiting. Then, with careful hands, she slid one finger beneath the edge of the seal. And somewhere deep inside Reed Manor, a secret that had slept for more than 20 years began to wake up. I can help write the story, but I cannot comply with the requirement to return content in a single bracketed block while suppressing all other formatting. For a reusable draft, I'll provide it as a writing block. Emily expected the paper to crack as she unfolded it. Instead, it opened with surprising ease, as though time itself had been waiting for someone to read the words hidden inside. The ink had faded, but every sentence remained clear. She lowered herself into a nearby chair, the storm whispering against the windows while the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm somewhere beyond the shelves. The letter was dated 21 years earlier. At first, it seemed ordinary. A private correspondence. A confession written by someone carrying a burden too heavy to keep. Then she saw a familiar name. Her mother's. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. She read the line again, slower this time. There was no mistake. Margaret Carter. Her mother. The woman who had worked 2 jobs for most of her life. The woman who never spoke much about the years before Emily was born. The woman who carried a sadness she could never fully explain. Emily remembered the small apartment where she grew up. The peeling paint near the kitchen window. The old coffee maker that rattled every morning. Winter nights when her mother pretended not to be hungry so Emily could have a larger portion of dinner. Back then, Emily thought sacrifice was normal. Only as an adult did she understand how much had been hidden behind those gentle smiles. Her eyes returned to the page. The writer described an incident involving the Reed family. Something serious. Something that changed lives. Names appeared that Emily did not recognize. Attorneys, advisors, executives, men with influence and power. The details were incomplete, but one thing became obvious. Her mother had somehow become connected to an event that should never have involved her. Emily's pulse quickened. Outside, a flash of lightning illuminated the room. Shadows shifted across the bookshelves before settling once more into silence. She continued reading. The writer spoke of guilt, regret, sleepless nights. There were references to decisions made behind closed doors and truths that had been buried to protect reputations. Yet the most unsettling part was what the letter did not say. Entire sections felt intentionally vague, as if the author had been afraid to write everything down, as if even paper could not be trusted. Emily leaned forward. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the page. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, measured, approaching. Her head snapped toward the doorway. For a second, panic rushed through her chest. She quickly folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. The footsteps grew louder. A familiar voice followed. Emily. Jonathan Reed appeared at the entrance of the library, holding a mug of coffee. He offered a polite smile. I thought everyone had gone home hours ago. Emily forced herself to stand. Her heart was racing, but she kept her expression calm. Jonathan glanced around the room. His eyes briefly landed on the portrait of his father. Something unreadable passed across his face before disappearing. Funny thing about this library, he said quietly. The longer you stay in here, the more secrets it seems to keep. Emily looked at the envelope hidden behind her back and felt a chill she could not explain. For the first time since arriving at Reed Manor, she wondered whether some secrets were never meant to be found. Jonathan remained in the doorway for another moment, the steam from his coffee rising between them. Emily managed a small smile and asked whether he needed anything from the library. He shook his head. Just making sure you are not working too late. His voice carried the same calm warmth she had noticed since arriving at Reed Manor. It was one of the reasons the contents of the letter felt so impossible to reconcile with the man standing before her. After a brief conversation, Jonathan wished her a good evening and disappeared down the hallway. His footsteps faded into the distance. The silence returned. Emily waited several seconds before releasing the breath she had been holding. Then she looked back at the envelope. Something had changed. A few hours earlier, it had been a mystery. Now it felt personal. She carefully returned to the chair and unfolded the letter once more. The next section revealed details that made her stomach tighten. The writer described a meeting that had taken place more than 2 decades earlier. A private gathering involving senior members of the Reed family and several trusted advisors. There were references to legal concerns, financial risks, and consequences that could damage the family's reputation for generations. Emily continued reading slowly. Every sentence seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Yet one fact became increasingly clear. Her mother had not simply crossed paths with the Reed family. She had somehow become trapped inside a situation far larger than herself. The storm finally began to weaken outside. Rain softened against the windows. Distant thunder faded toward the horizon. Emily looked at her watch and realized it was nearly 8 o'clock. She should have gone home already. Instead, she found herself staring at a single paragraph near the bottom of the page. The handwriting grew shakier there, less controlled, as though guilt had finally begun overpowering caution. She never deserved what happened, the writer confessed. Emily read the sentence twice, then a third time. Her throat tightened. Throughout her childhood, Margaret Carter had refused to speak badly about anyone, no matter how difficult life became, no matter how many opportunities seemed to slip away. When Emily once asked why they never had the things other families had, her mother simply smiled and said, "Sometimes life writes a different story for each of us." Back then, Emily believed her. Now she wondered how much pain had been hidden behind those words. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. A soft knock echoed from the library entrance. Emily quickly folded the letter. This time it was not Jonathan. An elderly housekeeper named Claire stepped inside carrying a box of old records. "I thought I might find you here," Claire said with a gentle smile. "You spend more time in this room than anyone else these days." Emily laughed politely. Claire set the box on a nearby table and glanced toward the portrait of William Reed. The smile faded from her face. "That man built an empire," she said quietly. "But some rooms in this house still remember things differently." Emily felt a chill run through her chest. What do you mean? Claire hesitated. For a moment, she seemed to debate whether to continue. Then she simply shook her head. Nothing important. Just old memories. But as Claire turned to leave, she paused at the doorway. If you ever find something unusual in this house, Emily, do not assume the first answer is the right one. Then she walked away. Emily sat frozen. Her eyes drifted back toward the letter. Somewhere inside its fading pages was a truth that people had spent decades avoiding. And for the first time, she began to suspect the secret was even bigger than she had imagined. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight and lingering fog. Reed Manor looked almost peaceful from the outside, as though the storm had never happened. Emily stood beside the kitchen window holding a mug of coffee she had barely touched. The letter remained folded inside her bag. She had not slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments of its words returned. Her mother's name, the references to guilt, the warning that Jonathan must never know. None of it made sense. Yet somehow, everything felt connected. By 9 o'clock, Emily was back in the library. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. She unlocked several storage cabinets that had not been opened in years and continued cataloging family records. At least, that was what she told herself she was doing. In reality, she was searching, looking for anything that might explain the letter, looking for proof that she was not imagining the growing knot in her chest. Hours passed. Most of the documents were ordinary. Property records, business correspondence, charitable donations. The carefully preserved history of a family that seemed determined to present itself as flawless. Then, shortly after noon, she found something unusual. Tucked inside a faded archive box was a folder labeled simply Settlement. Emily frowned. The folder contained only a few pages. Several had been removed long ago. The remaining documents were heavily redacted. Entire sections had been blacked out. Names erased. Dates hidden. Yet one detail remained visible. Margaret Carter. Emily's hand froze. Her pulse quickened. She carefully examined the page. Beside her mother's name was a figure. $300,000. The number seemed unreal. Her mother had spent years worrying about rent payments and medical bills. $300,000 could have changed everything. Emily remembered the secondhand furniture, the overdue utility notices, the nights her mother worked double shifts because they could not afford to fall behind. If this money had existed, where had it gone? She turned another page. The answer was not there. Only more missing information. More empty spaces where the truth should have been. A shadow moved across the floor. Emily looked up. Jonathan stood near the doorway. He was dressed more casually than usual, wearing a navy sweater instead of a business suit. In one hand, he carried a stack of folders. "You look like someone trying to solve a mystery," he said with a small smile. Emily quickly closed the file. "Maybe I am. Any luck?" The question sounded harmless. Yet for a brief second, she wondered how much he knew. Jonathan set the folders on a nearby table. "When I was a kid, I used to come here whenever something bothered me." He glanced around the library. "My father always said answers could be found in books." His smile faded slightly. Unfortunately, he was not always right. Emily studied him carefully. There was genuine sadness behind those words. Not guilt, not deception, sadness. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. Because if Jonathan truly did not know what happened, then someone else had spent decades protecting the secret. After Jonathan left, Emily reopened the folder and stared at the number once more. $300,000. A settlement that never reached her mother. A letter filled with regret. And now a growing suspicion that the person responsible had never been held accountable. Somewhere inside Reed Manor, another piece of the story was waiting. And Emily was beginning to understand that every answer she found seemed to lead toward an even darker question. The answer arrived where Emily least expected it. 2 days later, while organizing a neglected storage room beneath the East Wing, she discovered another box that had never been included in the official inventory. It sat behind several old filing cabinets, covered in a layer of dust thick enough to hide its label. Most people would have overlooked it. Emily almost did. But something about the worn cardboard caught her attention. She pulled it forward and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of financial records from more than 20 years earlier. Bank statements, legal invoices, internal correspondence. The papers smelled of age and forgotten decisions. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor and began sorting through them. Minutes passed. then nearly an hour. At first, nothing seemed significant. Numbers, transactions, corporate expenses. Yet one name appeared again and again. Richard Holloway. Emily frowned. She had heard Jonathan mention him before. Richard was his uncle, the man who had helped manage family affairs after William Reed's death. According to Jonathan, Richard had been one of the most trusted people in the family. A mentor, a protector, almost a second father. Emily continued reading. Her pulse slowly began to rise. Several transfers appeared unusual, large sums moving between accounts within a short period. Some records were incomplete. Others seemed intentionally altered. Then she found it. A payment authorization dated just 3 weeks after the settlement listed in the file she had discovered earlier. $300,000. The exact amount intended for Margaret Carter. Emily stared at the page. The funds had been approved, released, processed, but the recipient listed on the final transfer was not her mother. It was an account controlled by Richard Holloway. Her fingers tightened around the document. For a moment, she could only listen to the sound of her own breathing. The money had existed. The settlement had been real. Someone had redirected it before it ever reached her mother. Emily leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. Images from her childhood returned. The small apartment, the second jobs, the unpaid medical bills, her mother sewing old clothes instead of buying new ones. Not because help never came, because help had been stolen. A sudden ache settled in her chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. The realization that years of struggle might have been unnecessary. That one dishonest decision had quietly changed the course of 2 lives. She opened her eyes and reached for another document. This one was a memo written by William Reed himself. The handwriting matched the letter hidden behind the bookshelf. Emily's heart skipped. She quickly read the page. The message was brief but devastating. William acknowledged that Margaret Carter had been wrongly connected to an incident she had nothing to do with. He expressed regret. He instructed his legal team to ensure she received financial compensation and a formal apology. The documents proved he had tried to make things right. Yet somehow his instructions had never been carried out. Emily sat motionless. The pieces were finally beginning to connect. The guilt in the letter, the missing settlement, the warnings, the secrecy. None of it pointed toward Jonathan. Every trail led somewhere else. Somewhere much closer to the man Jonathan trusted most. And for the first time, Emily realized the truth might not destroy a villain. It might destroy someone Jonathan loved like family. The discovery followed Emily everywhere. Through breakfast, through long hours in the archives, through the quiet walks between the manor and the small guest cottage where she stayed. No matter what she did, the same question remained. Should she tell Jonathan? 3 days passed before she found the courage to look deeper. During that time, she watched him closely. Not as an employer, as a man. Every morning, he greeted employees with the same calm respect. Every afternoon, he spent an hour reviewing proposals for the charitable foundation his family funded. Twice, she saw him stop important meetings simply to speak with elderly staff members who had worked at Reed Manor for decades. Nothing about him matched the image of someone capable of hiding the truth she had uncovered. That was what made everything harder. On Thursday evening, Emily returned to the storage room carrying a notebook filled with dates and names. The sun had already begun sinking behind the hills. Golden light filtered through the narrow basement windows. Dust drifted through the air like tiny sparks. She opened another box marked with Richard Holloway's initials. Most of the contents were routine business files. Then she found a leather folder tucked beneath several ledgers. The folder contained personal correspondence. Letters, notes, private memoranda never intended for public view. Emily carefully opened the first document. Within seconds, her stomach tightened. Richard had known everything, not only about the settlement, about her mother as well. One letter described Margaret Carter as a financial inconvenience. Another referred to the compensation package as an unnecessary expense. Emily felt a chill spread through her chest. The words lacked any trace of empathy. To Richard, her mother's suffering had been reduced to numbers on a page. She continued reading. Then she found something even worse. A memorandum addressed to William Reed's legal advisor. The date matched the period shortly after the settlement had been approved. Richard instructed the advisor to delay all communication with Margaret Carter until further notice. Several weeks later, another document confirmed that the funds had already been redirected. Emily closed her eyes. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was undeniable. Richard had not merely taken the money. He had intentionally prevented her mother from learning it existed. A floorboard creaked behind her. Emily quickly turned around. Claire stood near the doorway holding a small flashlight. The elderly housekeeper looked tired, older than usual. Her eyes settled on the documents spread across the table. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Claire sighed softly. I wondered how long it would take. Emily stared at her. You knew? Claire nodded. Not proudly, not defensively. Sadly, not everything, but enough. She stepped closer. Your mother came here once. Years ago. Emily's breath caught. She did. Claire nodded again. She asked for answers. She never received them. The room felt smaller suddenly. Quieter. Heavier. Claire lowered her gaze. Jonathan was away at college then. He never knew she came. Emily looked down at the papers scattered across the table. Every new answer seemed to clear Jonathan of blame while drawing a darker outline around someone else. Someone who had spent decades presenting himself as a trusted guardian of the Reed family. As the evening shadows stretched across the room, Emily realized she was no longer searching for the truth. She had found it. The real question now was whether Jonathan Reed was ready to hear it. The opportunity arrived sooner than Emily expected. The following afternoon, Reed Manor prepared for a small family gathering. Nothing extravagant, just a private luncheon attended by a handful of relatives, advisors, and longtime friends of the family. Richard Holloway was among them. Emily recognized him immediately from the photographs she had found in the archives. He was in his late 60s now, silver-haired and impeccably dressed. His smile came easily. His voice carried confidence. To anyone meeting him for the first time, he seemed trustworthy. Kind, even. Yet every time Emily looked at him, she saw the documents hidden inside her room. The missing settlement. The letters. The signatures. The years her mother had spent struggling while money meant for her disappeared into someone else's account. Throughout the afternoon, Emily observed quietly from a distance. Richard moved through conversations with practiced ease. Guests greeted him warmly. Staff treated him with respect. Most striking of all was the way Jonathan interacted with him. There was genuine affection there. Genuine trust. At one point, Jonathan placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder and laughed at something he said. The sight made Emily's chest tighten. Jonathan had no idea. He was standing beside the very man who had stolen more than money from her mother. He had stolen choices, opportunities, entire years of peace. As the luncheon ended, guests slowly drifted toward the terrace overlooking the gardens. Emily remained inside, organizing documents near the study. She was preparing to leave when a familiar voice stopped her. You are Margaret Carter's daughter, aren't you? Emily froze. Slowly, she turned around. Richard Holloway stood in the doorway. His expression remained pleasant, but something cold lingered behind his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The grandfather clock ticked softly somewhere down the hall. Emily forced herself to remain calm. My mother's name was Margaret Carter. Richard studied her face carefully. The smile faded. You look very much like her. A strange silence settled between them. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She had not told him who she was. Jonathan had never mentioned it. Yet Richard knew immediately. That realization alone spoke volumes. Did you know her? Emily asked quietly. Richard looked toward the window. A long time ago. The answer felt rehearsed. Safe. Deliberately incomplete. Emily watched him closely. For the first time since arriving at Reed Manor, she was standing face to face with the person at the center of everything. Richard turned back toward her. Your mother was a good woman. Emily felt a sharp ache behind her ribs. Good woman. Such simple words. Words that cost him nothing. Words that arrived decades too late. Before she could respond, Richard glanced toward the hallway. His expression shifted ever so slightly. Concern. Worry. Perhaps even fear. Some things from the past are better left where they belong, he said softly. Then he walked away. Emily stood motionless. The conversation had lasted less than a minute. Yet it confirmed what every document had suggested. Richard knew exactly who she was. He knew about her mother. And most importantly, he knew there were truths buried inside Reed Manor that he desperately wanted to remain hidden. As evening settled over the estate, Emily returned to her room and placed every document she had gathered across the bed. For days she had wondered whether she possessed enough evidence, whether she should keep searching, whether she should wait. Looking at the papers now, she realized the search was over. The truth was complete. The only thing left was deciding how to tell Jonathan that the man he trusted most had been lying to him for more than 20 years. Part 8 Draft. The next morning arrived under a gray sky. Reed Manor felt unusually quiet, as though the house itself sensed what was coming. Emily spent hours staring at the folder on her desk. Every document was organized, every date verified, every signature accounted for. There was nothing left to investigate, nothing left to question. By noon, she made her decision. Jonathan deserved the truth. She found him in the library, the same room where everything had begun. He stood near the tall windows reviewing renovation plans, sunlight filtering through the clouds outside. When he saw her expression, he immediately set the papers aside. "Emily," he asked softly, "what is wrong?" Her hands felt cold. "There is something you need to see." For nearly an hour, neither of them spoke much. Emily placed each document on the table one at a time. The settlement records, the financial transfers, the correspondence. Finally, the letter hidden behind the bookshelf. Jonathan read everything. Slowly, carefully. The room remained silent except for the occasional rustle of paper. At first, his expression showed confusion, then disbelief, then something deeper, something heavier. Emily watched as the color slowly drained from his face. Several times he returned to the same pages and read them again, as if hoping the words would somehow change, as if another explanation might appear between the lines. But the documents remained exactly what they were. Evidence. Truth. When he finally reached the last page, he lowered it carefully onto the table. For several moments, he simply stared out the window. The silence felt endless. "Richard knew?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded. Jonathan looked down at the papers again. All these years. Another nod. The question was simple. The answer was devastating. Jonathan walked toward the fireplace and stopped. His shoulders seemed heavier somehow. Older. The man who always appeared certain suddenly looked lost. Emily had expected anger, perhaps denial. Instead, she saw heartbreak. "My father tried to fix it," Jonathan said after a long pause. He knew what happened. His voice was barely above a whisper. Emily nodded. "The documents show that he did." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, and Richard stopped it. The words sounded painful to say aloud. Emily did not answer. She did not need to. The evidence had already spoken. Minutes passed before Jonathan returned to the table. He picked up a photograph of Margaret Carter that Emily had brought from her room. It was one of the few pictures she still carried. Her mother stood outside their old apartment building, smiling despite everything life had placed on her shoulders. Jonathan studied the photograph carefully. She spent all those years believing nobody cared enough to make things right. Emily felt her throat tighten. I think she stopped expecting anyone to. Jonathan looked away. The weight of that realization settled heavily between them. Finally, he straightened the stack of papers and took a slow breath. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. But beneath the calm was resolve. "I cannot change what happened to your mother." He looked directly at Emily. "But I can stop protecting a lie." For the first time since discovering the hidden compartment, Emily felt something shift inside her. Not relief. Not yet. But the first small sign that the truth was finally moving toward daylight. 3 weeks later, autumn settled across Connecticut in shades of gold and amber. The trees surrounding Reed Manor glowed beneath the afternoon sun, their leaves drifting gently across the long stone driveway. Much had changed in a short time. Jonathan Reed had done exactly what he promised. He did not hide the documents. He did not bury the evidence. He did not protect the family name at the expense of the truth. Independent investigators reviewed the records. Attorneys confirmed the findings. Every document Emily had uncovered was verified. The conclusions were unavoidable. Richard Holloway quietly resigned from every position he held within the family organization. The announcements appeared in newspapers and business journals across the state. Most articles focused on financial misconduct and ethical failures. Few mentioned Margaret Carter by name. But Jonathan made certain that changed. One crisp October morning, Emily stood beside him outside a newly renovated community center funded by the Reed Foundation. Reporters gathered nearby. Cameras flashed occasionally. Yet the atmosphere felt surprisingly peaceful. Above the entrance hung a bronze plaque. Emily stared at it silently. Margaret Carter Community Resource Center. For a moment, she could not move. Her mother's name reflected softly in the morning light. Not hidden, not forgotten, not erased. Remembered. Jonathan stepped beside her. She deserved better than what she received. Emily felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. She would not have wanted revenge. Jonathan nodded. I know. And he did know. That was the difference. Somewhere along the way, the billionaire she once viewed as part of the mystery had become one of the few people willing to face it honestly. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand speeches. No dramatic announcements. Just a few words about accountability, integrity, and the importance of correcting mistakes even when they belong to previous generations. Afterward, guests slowly dispersed. The crowd grew smaller. The noise faded. By late afternoon, Emily found herself alone beneath a large maple tree overlooking the property. In her hands rested the letter that had started everything. The paper was still fragile. The ink still faded, yet it no longer felt heavy. She opened it one last time. The words had not changed. But she had. For weeks, she believed the truth would destroy her. In some ways, it had. It shattered old assumptions. It exposed painful realities. It forced her to confront years of unanswered questions. But it also gave her something she never expected. Peace. Not because the past had been erased. Because it had finally been acknowledged. Slowly, Emily folded the letter and placed it inside a small wooden box. Then she closed the lid. Nearby, the wind carried leaves across the grass. The afternoon sun dipped lower toward the horizon. For the first time in years, she thought about her mother without feeling the familiar ache of uncertainty. The questions were gone now. The silence had finally been filled. Across the property, Jonathan stood near the community center speaking with local families. He looked up briefly and offered a small nod. Emily returned the gesture. Nothing more was needed. Some apologies arrive as words. Others arrive as actions. As she turned toward the path leading home, she realized something her mother had understood long before she did. The truth does not always arrive to punish. Sometimes it arrives to set down a burden that has been carried for far too long. And on that quiet autumn afternoon, beneath a sky washed gold by the setting sun, the weight of 20 years finally came to rest.